Hey everyone. Before we get into today's interview, just wanted to drop a little reminder to stay up to date with all the latest episodes of On the Margin. You can subscribe to the Blockworks Macro YouTube. Just go up there, just click the little subscribe button, or you can click the links at the top of this episode. It'll take you over to Apple, Spotify, whatever your preferred platform is. Just subscribe there. If you could, leave a rating and review. Really appreciate it. All right, on with the show. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of On the Margin. Today, I am joined by repeat guest Leland Miller, who is the founder and CEO at the China Beige book. Leland, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll just dive right in. So, Leland, a little birdie told me that China might not actually be on the doorstep of an imminent collapse. I'm shocked here because that's the narrative that I seem to keep hearing from mainstream media. Can you give us a little bit of an actual view into what's going on with the Chinese economy and why that notion is not correct?
Yeah, it was interesting because over the summer we started getting all these emails, from CNBC and Bloomberg, and it's China collapsing, and we were like, all right, well, that's what they want us to talk about. That doesn't mean anything. But then we started getting a lot of client emails saying, hey, look, is this the hard landing? Is China collapsing? And we ignored it until we couldn't ignore it anymore. And then we ended up putting out just a slew of notes explaining, no, China's not collapsing. No, it's not a questionable borderline case. Here's all the reasons why people should understand that 2023 is seeing a recovery. It's a pathetic recovery, but it's a sequential recovery nonetheless, and that is a very far cry from collapse. So we've focused on the consumption story and the manufacturing story, and of course everyone's worried about property, and that's part of the economy. But focus on that and just go one by one and say, look, China's not doing that well, but what's happening in China right now is actually quite similar to what you saw in 2021. In 2021, Evergrande was scaring everybody. It was going to be contagion from Evergrande. 2023, it's Country Garden. Everything's going to fall apart because of the property contagion. That's not the way China works. It's not the way China's financial system works. We probably talked about it in the 2021 context the last time you and I spoke, but in any case, it is a it's interesting because I didn't expect that the big thing we would have to defend is why China is not collapsing. That wasn't on the bingo card for like July of 2023.
Maybe just to rewind the clock back to the start of this year, I think there was a lot of anticipation, a very hot narrative of the China opening and the growth that was going to drive. So I think what people in the US maybe were extrapolating was that there was a period of time where the US was locked down. When we turned the economy back on, we injected a lot of stimulus. Transfer payments were enormous. And that actually put the economy into hyperdrive. And the thought was that was what was going to happen in China. I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it clearly didn't play out exactly like that. Although, to what you just mentioned, there has been some sort of steady month-over-month growth under the hood. It just wasn't what we all expected. So why has the growth, and we'll get to inflation as well, but specifically, why has the growth story just been so different this year in China from what we all expected at the beginning of the year?
Yeah, well, the expectations, you're right, at the beginning of the year was that there's going to be some sort of super mega rally and everyone was going to get rich off A shares. Hindsight, it's wrong. It was wrong at the time. I mean, we were screaming into the wind that this was a ridiculous expectation to have, at least early on in the year. So when Xi Jinping pulled back the COVID zero Band-Aid, everyone got real excited. They said, we saw what happened when things closed down and opened up the United States. And of course, China and the United States seem very similar. So, we're going to have this explosive rally early on in the year. And what we said to that was, look, Q2 is TBD. We'll see what happens in Q2. But Q1, there's absolutely zero prospect of there being a rally in December, January, February, even March most likely, because hundreds of millions of people were going to get COVID. Everyone was running from the virus, so they had the virus. You had a very significant COVID zero administrative state that had to be broken down nationally and provincially and locally. And so there was never really a chance that you were going to have this explosion on the consumption side early in the year. Keep in mind, too, that in the United States, you had huge household stimulus. And in China, you didn't. So not only is China a different type of, economy in terms of saving, much more savings oriented than the U.S. consumer-driven economy. But also you had a ton of consumer stimulus in the United States. So everything was set up for there to be a big rally in the United States, too big a rally, I would say. And in China it was the opposite. So the what people thought was a similar situation was never all that similar. But what's interesting is when you got into Q2, there was a real legitimate question of whether you were going to see, a decent rally, a super rally, an extended rally, a short term. It was a big question, and we had urged people to temper some of their expectations, but even we were surprised at how this rally, this recovery ended up being. So you get into the spring, and we were expecting better numbers, and in April and May and June, and they were better. And there was a recovery, and there was a sequential recovery, which is what people were missing, who were overly focused on, the wrong pieces of official data that they didn't understand, like the official manufacturing PMI. But that you saw sequential recovery. You look at our data, you look at China Beige Book data, you look at Caixin data. Things were getting better month to month. Everything is better than last year when there was mostly lockdowns throughout. So there is recovery, but it was just an extremely disappointing, quite pathetic recovery, and that sort of carried on into the summer when it combined with the fact that the property sector was getting worse, not better, with the fact that shadow banks started wobbling. Then everyone started saying, well, not only are we not going to get a big rally, not only are we not seeing a recovery, maybe China is going to collapse. And that was sort of when everything jumped the shark. But nevertheless, people went, as is the want with China, everyone is usually very bipolar. Markets are very bipolar on China. They're either really excited about this soaring opportunity right around the corner, stimulus ahead, whatever it might be, or they think China's a day away from collapse. And so we flip back to the China collapse scenario over the summer, which was incorrect. And, we are still seeing a sequential recovery, through Q2, through Q3. It's just not a very good one. And property is a mess, but property is only part of the economy. And what they're doing in property is being done because the government feels comfortable deflating the property bubble. This isn't happening, randomly. It's happening because the government's trying to, engineer a letting, a bubble popping, letting air out of the bubble, at least of the property sector. And that's painful. But they are doing it in a somewhat controlled fashion, and it looks ugly and it's painful, but it is being engineered nonetheless. So things are great in China, but they're certainly not collapsing. And that's where we are.
All right. There were a couple things that I want to underscore and highlight there, Leland. And one was just the very different nature of the U.S. consumer demand-based economy versus what happens in China. So I want to return to that in a second. But the point that you made, you've made this point, I think, in every interview that you and I have had together, but I want to just continue to underscore it for the audience, is that China is a non-commercial financial system, right? So the way that things like counterparty risk in China work is just very different from the U.S. system, because there's a central authority that can say, you lend to you. So China isn't as much at risk for things like a Lehman moment, right? Which people in the US tend to, or sort of Western economies that do have more market-based systems tend to look for. So I just want to again underscore and see if you have anything else to kind of highlight on that. But I think that's a very important point for the audience to understand in terms of how China's setup is different from ours in the US.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It all comes down to the financial system. We have a note template that China is not hitting its Lehman moment, and it looks like a Mad Lib sheet. And we just insert, the parties of, that are the circumstances of the time and the dates of the time. And otherwise, it's the same note. And we just, put it out whenever there's someone comes out and markets start panicking. It's a Lehman moment. China is not going to have a Lehman moment. China's system does not allow for a Lehman moment. So why this is important is that a lot of people saw what happened in the US and they saw what happened in Europe. Like, well, China's a mess too. It's just a matter of time before they have their crisis too. The financial systems are very different. So you brought up the fact that China has a non-commercial financial system. What does that mean? It means that essentially China controls all the counterparties in its economy. You don't have counterparty risk when the government can step in and tell a borrower to borrow, a supplier to supply, a lender to lend. It makes sure that you don't freeze up liquidity. You have the motions of the economy, the gears of the economy continue to run. Now, there's a lot of downsides to this, but the upside to this, is that you have a crisis and you sort of swoosh and swoosh, tidal waves of capital from one side of the economy to the other to plug up problems. So you're constantly chasing good money after bad, and you're constantly, having good companies bail out bad companies, and solvent governments bail out insolvent local governments or local government financing vehicles. What's the downside? The downside is over time, so much good money is chasing after bad. So much new capital is going to unproductive uses versus productive uses that you have a massive slowdown. Productivity tanks, growth tanks, and you have stasis at extremely low levels of growth. That's where China's headed. That's the downside to China's model. It's not susceptibility to an acute crisis where there actually is very little susceptibility to a Lehman moment. It's about the fact that the way the economy is built is chasing it down a rabbit hole of increasingly lower growth and lower productivity, and that's where China's headed.
So I heard you just say that China, the CCP, is sort of engineering a prick in the bubble of the property sector, and that started with Evergrande. So can you kind of walk us through why there's that prick in the bubble, and then let's just start with that.
Well, the way that China has traditionally reported growth and created growth was that there would be some sort of organic level of activity. Let's say it was 4.5% in some given quarter, and then they look at what the target was, and the government, which had based its reputation for many years, not anymore, but for many years on the idea of high levels of growth, would say, no, we need 8%. So the extra 3%, 3.5%, they would go to property. They'd put more credit into the property sector. They'd build more, and you create more activity. Because anyone who looks at these types of numbers understands that GDP is not a gauge of productivity in the economy. It's not productive growth. It's aggregate growth. So we used to tell the story a little tongue in cheek, but maybe not that tongue in cheek, that if you wanted to hit 8% growth in a quarter, all you do is build a bridge, tear it down, rebuild the same bridge, tear it down, rebuild the same bridge, tear it down, keep going until you hit 8 or 9 or 12 or 15% GDP. Now you'd have really bad consequences from that in the medium and long term. But that sort of shows that GDP growth is about aggregate growth. It's not about running your economy well. It's not about being productive. And so their focus used to be on these aggregate levels of growth, which they would treat as a report card on how they were doing. And so for a long time, property worked by saying, we need more growth. We're going to juice it up. Here's more growth, and let's build more bridges to nowhere, and let's build more, let's build more apartment complexes. Well, that's growth, but it wasn't the kind of growth that they should have been aiming for if they wanted to really strengthen China in the long run. So that was the way it worked for a while, and I think at a certain point, we can argue when that was. Xi Jinping and others decided this is actually very dangerous for China, because what we're doing right now is we are putting so much good money after bad. We're not working on productivity. We're not focused on innovation. We are building up to unsustainable levels of debt, and the rest of the world is. But we care more than the rest of the world because, in the United States and Europe and everywhere else, people run for 2-year terms and 4-year terms and 6-year terms, and they try to spend like crazy, and, then they get out and then they complain about, spending and debt. But in China, the party thinks it's going to be ruling the country for 50, 100, 1,000 years, whatever, So the idea is we can't pass the buck. We are the buck. We have to manage the situation. So I think that they became increasingly concerned that this economic model was dying out or would die out suddenly, and they didn't know what the ending was. So what Xi Jinping has been doing for a number of years now has been actively moving to try to curtail the old model and focus on slower, healthier growth. Now, some things he's doing quite well. If you look at what's happening in the property sector, everyone's complaining, oh, there's so much pain. Look at the economic dislocations. I think this actually is a very positive sign for Xi Jinping. He's doing what he said he would do. On the consumption side, which I know you're interested in too, they've been doing absolutely not. So property's got a better grade in terms of pushing forward reform than consumption, which is right now is pretty much an F. So some things are doing right, some things are doing wrong. But the idea here is that the old economic model, Xi Jinping's looking forward 10, 20, 50 years, saying that this is not going to work for China. We need to step in and change everything right now. And that's what they're doing. A lot of this change is being done because the party thinks it has to do it, not because, the economy's falling apart while the party sits there and, panics.
Yeah. Listening to you, what it reminded me of, I think it's Goodhart's law or something like that, is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And maybe that broadly sums up some of the problems with the Soviet economy back in the day. And maybe China is falling victim to the same idea. So that's very interesting. I want to actually move on to talk a little bit about Xi Jinping as well. And I want to get your sense on how, what his priorities are. So in many ways, I think it's kind of interesting from a Western seat. I think a lot of people look over at exactly what you just said about being able to say, hey, we're going to be the only party in power for 50 years. We're going to take a long-term view as opposed to these politicians that we get in Washington who are just so short-sighted. They spend 50% of their time raising money and they only care about themselves and their 2 or 4 years or 6 years in the limelight or whatever it is. But there's also some downsides to that as well, right? Maybe being just because an economy is so vast, it's very difficult to wrap your head around all of the different moving parts. And maybe the one child policy being the best example of something that seemed very long-sighted, but was really disastrous with the benefit of hindsight. And they're going to pay the price for that soon. You know, I suppose, could you kind of connect the dots here between what is going on in Xi's mind and what are his objectives on the political side of things and how that's going to continue to bleed into this slower growth story that you're painting here for China?
I think it all comes back to a changing of the social compact in China. Back a number of years ago, I guess it was 2021-ish, a lot of things started happening in China that were very different than any preceding year. And one of the things, of course, we saw straight from Xi Jinping was the Common Prosperity platform. And I was pushing, dealing with the wealth inequality across China. Of course, it's a problem around the world, but it's a big deal in China. The idea that the social compact for decades in China had been, we are the party, you will support us, we are the one party. And in return, we will deliver high levels of growth and we will make you rich. And I think as Xi Jinping and others looked at that economic growth model and said, look, this model's in trouble. It's either dying out or it could die at any time. We have to shift things around. And we want to redefine the social compact as we will no longer focus on high levels of growth. We will deliver slower, healthier growth. We will spread it around more evenly. We will deal with wealth inequality and we will make China stronger and we will, spread the riches more evenly. You saw that in the Common Prosperity campaign, where the idea was, look, some people have benefited more than others. We're going to reverse that. You saw that in the tech sector crackdown. You saw that in the arrests of big billionaire moguls across the economy. You saw that in the cutting down in tutoring that was advantageous to certain segments of the society and others. Essentially what was going on socio-politically, economically across the board was this idea that we need to redefine our social compact with the people. The old one doesn't work anymore. And we need to redefine it for the coming age. And so part of what happened was what happened in Common Prosperity and tech sector, et cetera. And then part of what happened was a rethinking of the economic growth model. And what you saw was much lower growth, much more, many more points of weak data that were being announced that they admitted to. I mean, it was remarkable. We couldn't believe that they were announced, not just changing the model, but they were admitting to just how bad some of the data were, month after month, quarter after quarter, and year after year. So they were changing, the entire, idea of what economic governance was in China. They changed the stimulus playbook. This is something that Wall Street just simply couldn't get their head around. They're starting to now, maybe. But for years and years, we used to do performances and panels and other things with all these, banks, and they would come on and to say, look, we understand how China works. We were taught that they like high levels of growth. They stimulate into weakness. There's no way there's going to be a bad party Congress year because that's just not how the Chinese communists run their economy. So there's all these predictions, stimulus, always a day away. And for years, not days, not weeks, not months, for years, every single Wall Street prediction on China was wrong. It was remarkable because it was all based on the idea that, Xi Jinping has a pain point. This is all for show. He'll eventually revert to this idea that he wants to drive high levels of growth. He'll eventually revert to the old stimulus playbook. None of that was happening. And we had an advantage because not only were we listening to what Xi and the government were saying, but we actually could look through China Beige book data and see what they were doing. And, we track growth and we track the labor market inflation, but what we really like to track is credit. And what we could see is that when people were out there predicting a huge wave of stimulus that was right around the corner, we were looking at our credit indicators. We were looking at borrowing. We were looking at bond issuance. We were looking at loan rejections and applications, pent-up demand, cost of capital. And we're like, none of these is auguring in a wave of even medium-sized stimulus. I mean, what are people thinking? We're looking at something that says absolutely no stimulus is happening. We're going the other direction. It's high deleveraging. It's supreme deleveraging in the property sector. And yet you turn on the TV and every Wall Street chop was out there saying, no, we're about to have a big A-share rally. We're about to have a big, bounce back in growth based on the fact that the Chinese communists love to stimulate. We're like, this is make-believe. So, for a while, you look at the indicators, and the funny thing was, we weren't saying anything different than Xi Jinping was saying. We were very much saying what the party was saying publicly. It's just that people who were watching the economy for decades didn't think that wasn't how they were taught to treat China in 2005 or 2015. So they kept the same playbook, the same expectations, the same, fanatical obsession with big stimulus right around the corner. And that's why people were wrong on China for years in a row. And only now are we starting to slightly see people open their eyes. But I'll tell you what did I get on Friday? And I thought people, had sort of given up the idea of big stimulus. Rumors going around that that people are disappointed in Xi, that the elders are cracking down, that Xi is going to have no choice but to do big stimulus. And we're asked to comment on this. And it's the same story. People don't want to think that China's not going to resort to big bang stimulus, but there has been no sign of it for many years, and there's no sign of it right now in our credit data.
What's going on, everybody? Thank you for listening to On the Margin. I just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know about a very special offer that we have coming out of Blockworks Research. Now, many of you will probably be familiar with our platform, but Blockworks Research is the most blue chip spot to get research, data, governance, models, and a whole lot more about the leading DeFi protocols in the space. I've leaned on our analysts time and time again to explain complicated concepts going on in DeFi to me like I'm 5 years old. They can do the same for you. If you invest in DeFi or are just interested in it, it is an absolute no-brainer. As a listener of On the Margin, and to say thank you all for listening to the show, you can use Margin 10 for a 10% discount, and that gives you access to everything, which would be weekly in-depth reports, live data, all of that good stuff. So again, that's code Margin 10 for a 10% discount. Link is in the show notes. Sign up now. Thank you later. One thing to highlight for folks who might not be as aware or in the weeds of what's going on in China compared to the US or Europe or whatever is the inflation picture in China is markedly different from basically all of the Western economies. So this headline CPI in China, going even back to October of last year, peaked at around just under 3%. And now it's actually, for the month of August, I believe it was negative. So just an extremely different picture in terms of CPI. And yeah, maybe that, Leland, is why some folks are speculating that eventually they have to do some form of stimulus. And it looks like, again, maybe setting a floor is a very good mental framework for people, because there have been some soft measures of stimulus, but not the big, giddy up for the economy that people were looking for. But yeah, that the inflation data in China is just very interesting, especially compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, there's a good story, and then there's a worrisome story in the inflation data right now. So China is not in the middle, is not undergoing broader deflation. I know that you see a number here and a number there, and then you get a headline about deflation in China. There is not deflation in China right now. But the worry is that coming off the year like 2022, when the economy was in lockdown and you had, contracting activity during huge chunks of the year, you should have had explosive inflation, or at least catch-up inflation in 2023. You had inflation, and during the spring, we saw pretty healthy inflation. But the surprise is that, look, you should be having more of it. With the world looking the way it does, and with the economy coming off a year of lockdown activity, you should have seen more explosive catch-up inflation. And what you're seeing right now is you're seeing, you saw stronger inflation in the spring. Now our inflation indicators are flat. You're seeing inflation, but it's very low inflation. That's not a problem. In some ways, it would be good, except that this is supposed to be when China's in their big recovery from last year. So the fact that you've got weak inflation right now during a time it should be much faster, it creates a question over what are we going to see early next year, for instance, when any semblance of recovery is long past. Are we going to tip into deflation? Are things just slowing down so dramatically because consumption it just doesn't have much oomph behind it? So the data are not worrisome right now, but because they're not stronger, it lends to the question, what are things going to be like early next year And are we going to have a problem then? And maybe so. Now, this is what the central banks come to us for, because, while they're interested in this shadow banking system and stresses in property and overall growth, what they have been worried about, Fed, others, it has been, how do we understand the inflation picture in China and what could be exported out of China into our supply chains? And when COVID zero lockdown was full throttle in 2022, we were getting questions from our central banks we work with. They were like, "Well, what are we supposed to expect?" Because we could see it either way. We could see the supply chain snafus and breakdowns in China creating inflation that's exported in the U.S. supply chains. Or you could see the opposite. You could see, deflation, based on, disappointing recovery. I mean, what's going to happen here? Is it going to be inflation? Is it going to be deflation? How do we look at this? Because this was like a big X factor for the Fed and other central banks that were trying to calibrate their policy. What actually happened in 2022 and now again in 2023 is rather Goldilocks. They didn't have a spike in inflation. They didn't have it too strong. They didn't have it too weak. The supply chain situation was a lot better. Did not have as many negative effects as we thought in, West Coast supply chains, although there were some. But there also wasn't a soaring rally that, juiced commodities last year and added to the worries the Fed may have on inflation. So there has not been a problem coming out of China on the inflation front for central banks in the last year and a half. And that has made their job much easier. But we have to watch this because, right now there's much more worries about deflation, which central banks are actually not terribly upset about. But China, because it's an X factor, is something that is being watched very carefully because it'll throw off a calibrated policy if people don't have the right data on it.
Yeah. So Leland, just to sum up, because we've been talking about China in isolation here, but obviously where I want to end this conversation is connecting China with what's going on a global basis. So the idea here is for folks that are still waiting for some sort of collapse in China, that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's because of this sort of command control structure that China has that's very different from a free markets-based system that we have over in Western economies. But the trade-off of that system is that we should be looking at more slow growth over the near, even long term in China, and that also dovetails with the new economic policy and sort of the reforming of the social contract that Xi has formed. Is that about an accurate summary of what we discussed?
You said it better than I did, and I think the way to encapsulate that even further into a bumper sticker is I think investors are far too bearish cyclically, but they're far too bullish structurally on what's happening in the economy. From both directions, I would say the consensus has some problems.
That's really interesting. So let's connect what's going on in China with global asset markets, because that's another area where I feel like there's an enormous amount of uncertainty and continued surprises around. So maybe just starting at the highest level, when you think about China's place within the world economy and how it tends to affect various asset markets, what's the sort of high level for the place that China occupies?
Well, China is a major net energy importer. So everyone wants to understand activity in China for that reason. I mean, it can affect prices of not just oil, but so many different commodities. So it's really important to understand the China story. We ended up working with a lot of commodities firms, that didn't have China. They weren't really worried about the China story, but they were worried about not getting the China story right, and it would throw off their commodity price forecasts around the world. So you can't get commodities right unless you understand China. So that's really a big issue. The connecting tissue, though, is another misconception, I would say, which is that China drives global growth. So everywhere I look, I see the same statement: China's driving global growth. And the reason people think this is China has high levels of GDP growth, and therefore, well, wait a second, China's growing at 5% this year, and someone else is growing at 2%. And you either look at the nominal numbers or look at the GDP growth things. China's growth is very high, and therefore China is the global growth driver. And I think that's exactly wrong. China's not the global growth driver. In some ways, it's actually the opposite, because GDP growth doesn't drive global growth. Trade does. And if you look at the divergence between Chinese exports, which have been at record numbers for years and years and years, especially during COVID. You see enormously strong export economy, and you look at imports, you see an enormously weak domestic economy when it comes to consumption. And so, what's actually happening, and because of the trade dynamics, trade surplus, China's actually hoovering up demand from the rest of the world. So I think not only is it wrong that China is driving global growth, the opposite is true. It's actually sucking up global growth and is a net negative overall because of how weak the domestic economy is, because how weak imports are. So, that this is a little bit different than the commodity question, but it's very important in understanding China's place in the world. We should not be rooting for high levels of Chinese GDP because somehow we think it's going to redound to the benefit of America or Europe or anyone else. If anything, it has been the opposite for years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you, in one of our previous interviews, where you made this exact point to me, where I said exactly what you just said, is that China being the engine of global growth. And the way you reframed it to me at the time was that actually it's really the U.S. consumer that is the energy of growth, and China is set up to feed that. But that's really interesting that I hadn't really thought of before, is that China, by virtue of, I mean, depending on how you think about this, is sort of wanting a weaker currency, not to call them outright currency manipulators, but also just structuring their economy in such a way to be the factory of the world. They're sort of, in a sense, sucking growth from, or a damper for growth on all the rest of the world, which is highly interesting. So how does this shift in Xi's policy domestically impact growth for the rest of the world then?
Well, I mean, what she's trying to do is say the idea of prioritizing artificially high levels of growth, GDP growth, et cetera. Those days are over. We don't care anymore. We have bigger priorities. You could say it's to restructure the economy, but what they really want to do is batten down the hatches so there's less vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the United States and others. I mean, part of that is on the national security side. It's vulnerability over the dollar and global payments and other things. Part of it's a domestic chip ecosystem, which they don't have in China, but they know that they're susceptible to stronger sanctions if those happen. So I think she is worried about making sure that other countries don't have more leverage over China to minimizing that leverage. And that's China's a food importer. It's an energy importer. It's a semiconductor importer. It's all these things. It has a lot of vulnerabilities. So she is focused on those. I know we can have a longer debate on whether it's possible to fix that problem at all, if it's a problem that can be fixed. But certainly the focus is on addressing the degree of vulnerability that China has to the rest of the world. That's where the focus is right now. That is where Xi Jinping's mind is. It's not on higher levels of growth. It's not on providing stimulus. It's certainly not on the stock market, which is done nothing. If you look at back 15 years to now, that's not a priority of the government right now. So we have to make sure that we are looking at the economy through Xi's eyes and not through the eyes of investors who want to see stimulus, who want to see a stronger A share market, who want to see bigger, trade numbers or GDP growth numbers. That's not Xi's perspective anymore.
All right, I want to return to that idea of seeing the world through Xi's eyes and through the United States' eyes. So I want to end on kind of this geopolitical power struggle that we're seeing. But I want to return to the point that you made about commodities. So commodities and maybe oil in general, I feel like that's critical to understand that picture for demand, because especially right now when we're trying to tease out what is the future of it, what is inflation going to look like in the US over the next couple of years. Obviously, commodities plays an enormous role in there, but really oil plays an enormous role in there too. And you can start to see with oil inching back up, well, you start to see economists say, oh, well, maybe inflation is going to be a little bit stickier because they're worried about that energy component in headline, at least. So in terms of, I know it's very, very difficult to sort of forecast this out, but is there any connection to be made there in between the changing picture for demand in China and the inflation picture over here in the United States?
Well, there is, because if you look at what's happened for the last 20 years, you've had low inflation in the United States in large part because China has exported disinflation through the production of cheaper and cheaper and cheaper goods. And so you've had enormous amount of goods disinflation over time, and that's kept U.S. inflation down. Now you have a couple things pushing back against that right now. You have decoupling, which of course is its own hour-long conversation because decoupling means something different to everybody who talks about it. But you have some aspects of the relationship between the U.S. or the West and China that are decoupling, like the tech sector. Others, financial sector, financial flows, not yet. But those are inflationary. Certainly, the more that we bifurcate supply chains, extricate China from supply chains. Don't worry about the lowest cost alternative and sort of the globalized solution, but worry about securing supply chains as the priority. All these things are inflationary. Now, what is happening out of China? Are we going to see inflation out of China? No, but the question is, if we see less disinflation, then that could have a big effect. We could still be seeing disinflation. We could even see some deflationary impulses occasionally out of China. But if it's less so than before, then that will, have a net inflationary, effect on the United States and the West. So how do you add up all these things? Technology is obviously deflationary. It's a much more complicated batch of inputs to sort of net out. But I think that the overall thrust of things is that, even if China continues to export disinflation in the United States, if it exports less disinflation than it did it before, then that is more that creates inflationary pressure in the United States. And so, this is an ongoing story. We're gonna have to watch how strong China's economy is, how much it tries to decouple. But that's the worry that the super strong deflationary impulse from China will either disappear or will be less strong in the future.
When people talk about inflation and the inflationary picture over in the things that they tend to talk about are technology. So we're in the midst of an AI boom, and I think you'd be pretty silly to ignore that. And obviously, that's going to be have an enormous impact on things. But technology across the board generally has a very deflationary impact. Demographics are critical. We sort of start to see the boom in demographics that happened post World War II run over, and in many different developed economies, they're facing a labor problem, especially in China, right? From my understanding, there's going to be something like 100 million people over the next decade removed from the working age population in China, which is certainly going to be a problem that they're going to have to deal with. But then there's this issue of, to me, I always tend to fall back on the most proximate issue, I think, which is the ability to borrow for at least developed economies from low-cost labor pools around the globe. And while there are these longer, more secular forces around deflate that are pointing in a more deflationary way, it would be very difficult for me to see, let's say, things like the CHIPS Act continue and we really try to decouple supply chains. I just don't see a world in the next 3 to 5 years, if we really go into that full bore, that doesn't have an extremely inflationary effect or outweigh the deflationary forces of demographics and technology. I know that was a bit more of a statement than a question, but I don't know how you would weigh.
I think that's fair. Look, if you're trying to add up all the deflationary components in the next couple of years, and you're adding them to the things that are probably going to be highly inflationary, if you net all that out, you're probably left with a picture, particularly in the next several years, which are more inflationary pressure than you saw before. So it doesn't mean you're necessarily looking at a future of very high inflation, because you do have deflationary and disinflationary forces pushing back against it. But yeah, I think that if you add everything up and you just look at the picture of globalization, not being totally reversed, but certainly being broken down from what it was, all of this is inflationary. So yeah, I think you have more inflationary pressures going forward than you did before. I think that's a safe baseline to have.
Leland, one question that I have for you, and I know no one has the answer to this, and we're wading into the realm of speculation here, but how possible is it to decouple the economic activity and frankly, just models of the United States and China? At this point, it just seems like, although politically it seems like they're moving further and further apart, although there is an article in the Wall Street Journal, September 28th, so last week, about the U.S. and China actually trying to do a Xi-Biden summit. So maybe there are going to be efforts to walk back some of the escalation and tension between these two nations. But it seems like politically we're moving further and further apart, and there's starting to be almost the beginnings of a groundswell in the U.S. if we shouldn't be doing business in China. That's not the moral thing to do, or whatever. But it seems like the relationship that we have, that at a very high level, outside of China holding a bunch of our reserves, is they are a surplus country and we are a deficit country. China has a surplus that they recycle into U.S. treasuries, although admittedly less and less these days. And we are a debtor country and we get cheap financing from the rest of the world. But historically, it's really been China. In addition to that, there are just, tens or hundreds of thousands of individual business links and relationships in between the US and China. And it really seems for the time being as if we are fully dependent on the other. So maybe the answer here is that, we're just going to have to find a way, and it's going to be extremely messy. But I wonder, how much you've thought about just the degree to which it's even possible to decouple at all.
I spend way too much time thinking about it. Actually,
I was going to say, I don't make assumptions, but I would guess you.
Yeah, no. This is maybe topic number one that I worry about and I get questions about from clients. So look, decoupling means a lot of different things. Decoupling in some extreme sense means, the two companies, iron wall between them, nothing happens. So you don't have capital flows from one to the other. You don't have supply chains from one to another. We're nowhere near that. And I think outside of a kinetic confrontation, presumably over Taiwan, you're not going to have people on both sides of the Pacific, particularly the United States, willing to take the pain required for doing any true sense of decoupling. A lot of talk. We're going to decouple this, we're going to decouple that. But when it comes down to paying the price for that, I don't think a lot of entities in the U.S. system, from Congress down to corporates, are going to be willing to pay that price unless deterioration in the relationship is much more significant than it is right now. That doesn't mean you can't have certain other types of decoupling, like tech sector decoupling. So what we are seeing right now, it's been uneven, it's been slow. It hasn't been very transparent, but you have seen tech sector decoupling where the United States is stepping in to ring fence some advanced technology from China. Semiconductors, things related to artificial intelligence, quantum, et cetera. The export controls are much weaker than people think. They have huge loopholes that you could drive a semi truck through the Swiss cheese nature of these things. But you are moving in that direction. So there is certain types of decoupling happening. You're just not seeing broader decoupling. And I think what happens is every time you feel a pressure point, then, China pushes back and say, okay, well, we control these rare earths. We control so many inputs to the green economy. Our firms are leaders of the world in electric vehicles and batteries. If you keep pushing this, then we're going to cause you pain on that. And so the question is that does the deterioration of the relationship or the negativity in the relationship, does it hit a certain level to which people are willing to take the economic pain from true decoupling? We're not there yet. There is a future where we could be, but I think that in terms of the process right now, it's very gentle. It's mostly tech sector. You are seeing supply chains getting uprooted from China because Western companies don't want to have the vulnerability to China geopolitically, or from a COVID style lockdown, or from trade tensions. And so you are seeing some elements of this, but you are not seeing a broader decoupling yet, because it's going to be a more costly process. And I don't think people understand how costly that will be and have, prepared themselves for paying that. There may be a time in the future where that changes, though.
In a past life, I used to work in consulting, and one of the things that we would specialize in and help with is the purchase of steel. Obviously, China is the largest global provider of steel, and steel broadly, there's a lot of, you get very granular in terms of how it ends up getting cut and processed and whatever, but there's sort of hot rolled and cold rolled steel. And a while ago, if you remember, actually in the Trump election back in 2016, a hot topic was steel and how we're going to do a tariff and ban, this was happening before Trump anyway, but we're going to do a tariff on hot rolled steel, or maybe it was cold rolled. And what you saw was that imports from China dropped drastically, but at the same time, almost 1-for-1, imports from Vietnam went up to compensate. And what was happening was China was shipping their steel to Vietnam. They were processing just enough to say that, yes, this was made in Vietnam, and then it was coming to the US through that direction. So there are just so many loopholes that you can get around some of these trade wars.
Absolutely. You brought back some memories from the old 301 trade tariff days, which are going to come back. I mean, look at who the leaders of the Republican race right now and the Democratic race are the two guys from 2020, and tariffs and other things are going to return to the headlines before not too long. So, it's been quiet on that front for a while, but I think we're about to return to that. And, maybe the next time we do a podcast, you're going to be asking me more about those same dynamics we talked about in 2016, 2017, 2018.
Leland, you've been super generous with your time here, and I want to underscore. I mean, one of the things that maybe we could have gone a little bit deeper into this interview, and is just the depth of data that the China Beige book has on what's going on the ground in China, and at least from my vantage and some of the different sources that I've seen, is very unique in terms of the depth and accuracy. So, if you want to give folks a little bit more of sort of an overview of what China Beige book does and how folks can find out either more information about you or China Beige book, or take a look into things, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so we have the largest private data collection operation in the world, focused on the Chinese economy. And what we try to do is provide an alternative to Chinese government statistics, and provide different types of statistics, and provide visibility into parts of the economy that investors don't have very good lens into, whether it's the labor market, it's the credit. Shadow credit worlds, it's inflation, and it's overall growth or regional growth, and so we try to carry on a dialogue that allows us to see the world through eyes that don't have the political lens that Beijing's numbers do. So that's what we do, we try to be part of the broader conversation. We release monthly flash data, we release quarterly data, we release, commentaries and economic notes on themes and subjects that we think are timely. We try to get as much of this into the, obviously we work for clients, but we try to get as much of this into the broader media realm as possible. And so, we're on Twitter regularly at China Beige book, and we get our coverage. Every month there's someone coming out with the China Beige book take and comparing it to the official take. So we're on Bloomberg and the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal, but we're also on Twitter. So if you want to track what we're doing, I think it's safe to say that we're one of the more provocative voices in the China field, in terms of calling it like we see it, and not letting people get away with marketing that we think is disingenuous and not real analysis. So we come at people on Twitter and we try to provide the real story, and we hope people find it amusing.
Yeah. 100% underscore. It's a great follow on Twitter. And what I would underscore out there for listeners in this audience who might not directly invest in China, it's still very important to understand what's going on in China, because that ripples out and impacts the entire global economy. So I would just underscore, even if you're like, well, I don't necessarily directly invest in China, there's a whole lot of reasons to subscribe, I would say. So Leland, thank you very much for coming on the show. I always enjoy our chats, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon.
This is great. Thanks for having me.